Welcome to Scriptfella. Today's film is all about history. My history here at Stonyhurst College, Lancashire, and it's also about the history of a feature film I worked on, God's Secret Agents, which was an adaptation of a non-fiction book. In part one, we unpack the story and the major beats of the movie so you can get a sense of what we're talking about. And in part two, I'll share a few tips I learned on how to adapt a historical book into a movie. So this is the book, God's Secret Agents. It's the story of John Gerard, a man who, when he came to England as a young Jesuit missionary, could only be described as a zealot. He was pursuing martyrdom, that he wanted to become a martyr, which is something that obviously resonates in this day and age. The twist is, he actually discovered his vocation was to live for the church and escape. Under Elizabeth I, they passed this law that any Catholic priest venturing onto the shores of England would be executed. And they didn't just hang them, they hung them, they drew them, they quartered them, they opened them up, they got their entrails and wound them onto a special winding machine, they cooked them, and then they chopped their genitals off before finally cutting their heads and their arms and their legs off. John Gerard believed he would go to heaven if he was caught doing the work of God.
There is that very fine line between preparing yourself for the possibility of martyrdom and seeming to openly desire it. I think they had to psych themselves up and say it was a desirable outcome. Otherwise, how would you psych yourself up to go over there, spend your whole existence in hiding until you get caught? There's no defense you can make that's going to acquit you. You know that it's a sure thing that you will end up on the scaffold. And a very, very, very unpleasant way to die.
When we approached Alice about adapting this book, she gave us a warning, which is dead priests don't sell. She'd had an absolute nightmare trying to get this book made. How do you make a 16th century Catholic priest relatable to audiences of today? Well, you can make him brave, you can make him cunning. I took a leaf out of the book of one of my favourite old films, The Scarlet and the Black, which is with Gregory Peck. He's an Irish Catholic priest in World War II in the Vatican, and he's helping Allied airmen escape from the Nazis. Remember, you've got to introduce your character at their most characterful, and the first time we meet Gregory Peck as a priest, he's actually in a boxing ring beating the crap out of another boxer. So immediately you're not thinking, here's a pious priest, and he wasn't like that at all. And neither was John Gerard. So Matt and I actually stole that scene and started with him beating up a big bruiser from the Swiss Guard in the Vatican. Before he comes to England, he's dispatched. He comes to find his martyrdom. He was pursued vigorously by the bad guy of our story, Richard Topcliffe, who was a priest hunter. So Topcliffe is the villain. He's the head of the priest hunters, the head of these posses that are roving around the English countryside looking for Catholics to capture and then kill. It's historically proven. He was a rapist, he was a murderer, he was a torturer. You would not want to be a Catholic priest and get caught by Richard Topcliffe. You got a bounty every time you caught one of these priests. And the family that was harbouring the priests, they would be fined as well and lose their property. And who would get that property? Well, the government and Richard Topcliffe. So this was an intolerable situation for the Jesuits, and so they evolved this system of safe houses. John Gerard, he actually created it with Nicholas Owen, who was a master craftsman. Owen created priest holes, so that when the priest hunters came in and raided these big country houses, the priests would hide. He could cheat space. Secret passages, secret doors, timbers that open. When you're trying to sell a project or get it made, there are two questions that you need to answer, which is one, why now? Why this project? And second, why you as a writer for this project? So for me, I went here to school, so I was brought up in the blood and sacrifice of the Jesuits, which impacted on me, but I also had a priest hole in my bedroom. I can't remember where it is, so we're going to enlist my daughter's help. She's studying for A-levels, so we better ask nicely. Can I ask you a big favour? Could you please help me come and find my old bedroom? Do you think it's still open?
Oh, the priest hole?
Yeah.
I think it may have been blocked up.
Why would they
for reasons that we cannot disclose. There's two ways to get into the Highline Girls' house.
Okay.
One is through this big room. This is called Shirk.
Okay, hold on, this feels familiar.
One of the priest halls will be in.
They have carpet now. They've had carpet. Why do they have carpet?
One of these rooms, I think it's
Everything has changed.
We're good. Here we go.
Oh, this is it! This is it!
I think this was Amy Brannigan's old room.
Okay, so we're overlooking the quad here.
Yeah.
So
Some dead curtains.
badass curtains, but
They're like...
here's the pièce de résistance. This is... They've locked it!
Yeah.
But look, it's got some sort of ventilation hole situation here. Came back from a rugby game and I put my boots in and it thudded on the bottom, and I was thinking, that sounds a bit odd. And I realised that there was this mechanism whereby the bottom of my boot cupboard opened up. And there was this huge gap, this cavity enough to hold a priest or a man. Because when this place was built in the late 16th century, it was a time where the priests were hunted down by the priest hunters. At one point, they'd narrow him down to a big country house like Stonehurst, like this, and they spend 3 days ripping down the walls and pulling up the floorboards and smashing the place up. And they know he's there, but they can't find him because he's in there. He's in under the grate in a priest hole underneath the fire. And he wrote this book, which Jan is going to show us in a minute. She's the curator here, which describes how he escaped.
So the original has not survived, but this is the oldest surviving complete copy. And it's, what I would say, late 17th century. And Stasi, being a Latin expert, can find the right page.
The searchers were searching all over the house, and they were cold, and they lit the fire to keep themselves warm. So the inside of the priest hole got very hot, and burning embers came and fell on him, and he had to stay quiet, even though they were burning the top of his head.
And there's ashes raining down.
The ashes are here.
The ashes, yeah, the ashes.
Oh, wow.
It's literally right there.
Of course we've got the ashes. Not the Australians. This is the ash. This was excavated from the hiding hole when it was opened for the first time in 1933. So they got into the priest hole for the first time since John Gerard had been captured there and swept up the ash, which had fallen onto his head.
He was down there for 3 days like this. No food, no water, and then he's being choked. And any other human being would have just freaked out and say, "Ah."
He managed to survive that praying all night.
So what Topcliffe did, he took this young woman, Anne Bellamy, who was the daughter of the woman who owned this country house, took her back to his castle, which he'd confiscated from a Catholic noble. He actually installed his own dungeon in there because he said that the instruments he had were superior to the ones in the Tower of London. As he put her on the rack, he raped her, he got her pregnant, and then he went into her and said, "If you don't bring Gerard to me, I'll tell the world that he got you pregnant and that you lay with a priest." And this poor 18-year-old girl, she met up with Gerard, she got in contact with him with the Catholic underground. The priest hunters pounced, they arrested him, they put him on trial. Who is cross-examining him? Who is prosecuting him? But his arch enemy, Topcliffe. So Topcliffe's multi-skilled. He does priest hunting, he does prosecution. What Alice did, she hunted down the archives of the court trial, and the transcripts read like an Aaron Sorkin movie.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth!
This huge argument breaks out between Topcliffe and Gerard about whether he's got the right to silence and a right to a fair trial. But it's a foregone conclusion.
He gets caught, and then most of it is about his time in the tower.
Gerard was imprisoned in the tower. He was taken to the Salt Tower. He was terrified he would reveal the location of all the priest holes that he'd set up with Nicholas Owen in the great country houses around England. Gerard was a goldmine of intelligence if the British government could just get it out of him. So they strapped into the manacles and stretched him, which was particularly hard on Gerard because he was such a big guy. He was like 6'4". He describes passing out in his book. They put a nail in his mouth to open his mouth and then poured scalding hot water into his mouth to wake him up. I mean, that's some wake-up call.
What is God to you? Has he abandoned you?
Is he such a worldly god that he must play at politics and the filth of conspiracy?
Gerard knew he was going to die. He couldn't bargain for his life, but just to make the pain stop, he was tempted. And he describes in his book the temptation to give in and just tell them what they wanted to know. But he held out, so they upped the game. They strapped into the rack to pull his muscles apart, inch by inch, cranking the pressure in the hope that he would break. But eventually Topcliffe ran out of ideas and said, right, we're going to kill you anyway. And the execution was set up, and Gerard's on his knees, he's praying to God. He knows this is what he wanted, and can he do it? And then he realizes, you know what? I want to live, and I want to do something. I want to beat this guy Topcliffe. I want to deny the hangman and the butcher. He needed some help. He needed to communicate with his friends on the outside, but how could he get word to them where all his correspondence was being read?
There's his oranges.
Somebody used to bring him oranges, but you could squeeze some juice out and you could write invisible letters, because orange juice is invisible ink. If you burn it, it appears again, you know, if you put a flame close to it. And the other thing was that he used the pith and the peel to make a sort of ad hoc rosary. He writes about being tortured, and then he writes about, of course, his escape.
Over here is the Salt Tower to my right, and that one there is the Cradle Tower. He managed to get into this space here, which is the Cradle Tower, begging the jailers to come and visit a man who needed some prayers. But while he was here, he tied this string to a bell, threw it over the battlements where the guys were here. They tied a rope to the string. Gerard pulled the string and the rope up to the top of the battlements, and then he abseiled down.
I mean, how does a tortured man escape?
Well, it was very difficult because he was not in a great physical state, and he literally climbed arm and leg, and there were bits, he says, where I was so exhausted I nearly dropped off. It took all my courage and all my strength to keep going. He managed to get away.
It's the stuff of Mission Impossible, James Bond and the Scarlet Pimpernel all rolled into one. It was a terrific achievement and must have created quite a stir, this priest who escaped the hangman in the dark after having been tortured. Not bad. And Topcliffe went looking for Gerard. We had this scene where he's searching this house, he's ripping it apart, and Topcliffe then dies of a heart attack just out of anger. And there's Gerard under the Elizabethan toilet with his rosary beads saying his prayers, deliver us from evil. And he lived, and he went to Rome, where he taught the other young novices to come here to England and how to survive, because that was the game, not to die. Their job was to administer to the Catholics who desperately wanted to go to Mass and have their kids baptized. A lot of people think, well, who's going to care what the Catholics want? But I think there's a story there that these guys are essentially fighting for religious toleration, and it felt like a modern day story. So I've heard it on good authority. There are 3 priest holes in Stonyhurst College. There's a second one. It runs all the way under here.
Apparently the deputy headmaster does have a fully opening trapdoor, but he's not here, so we can't exactly go and move his desk.
I mean...
Pass me the camera.
I don't think you're going to get the camera in there.
Now, don't let go. So he submitted the script to Alice, and she absolutely hated it. After all that work, all that passion, all that research, she said to me, you made a movie out of my book which reads like Top Gun in cassocks.